She called her husband 17 times while their son was dying. He silenced every single one. While 5-year-old Owen took his last breath in a hospital bed, Derek Mercer was in a luxury hotel suite with his mistress. He heard his phone buzz. He saw his wife's name flash across the screen, and he chose to ignore it. But Derek made one fatal mistake. He forgot who his father-in-law was, a retired federal prosecutor with 30 years of putting criminals behind bars, a man who doesn't forgive, a man who doesn't forget. What happens next will leave you satisfying. If you love satisfying the end, hit subscribe and let's begin. 6 months after Derek Mercer was led away in handcuffs, Carolyn stood at a podium in the grand ballroom of the Boston Harbor Hotel, looking out at 300 faces illuminated by crystal chandeliers. She had rehearsed this speech 17 times, the same number as those unanswered phone calls on the night her son died. Some numbers never stop haunting you. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. 6 months ago, I stood in a hospital room and watched my 5-year-old son take his last breath. Tonight, I stand before you to announce that Owen's Heart Foundation has funded cardiac monitoring equipment for over 200 families who couldn't afford it. The applause began softly, then swelled into something thunderous. Standing ovation. 300 people rising to their feet for a woman who had been shattered and somehow reassembled herself into something stronger. In the back of the room, Miles Holbrook wiped tears from his weathered face. His daughter had become extraordinary. Not just a survivor, a leader. But Miles noticed something else. A man in a dark suit slipping through the ballroom doors. Moving with purpose. Carrying papers. Carolyn continued speaking, unaware. Every child deserves access to life-saving care. Every parent deserves the peace of knowing their child is protected. In Owen's memory, we will fight until no family faces what we faced. More applause. Camera flashes. The moment was perfect. Until it wasn't. Excuse me. The man in the dark suit had reached the stage. He climbed the steps without hesitation, walked directly to Caroline, and thrust an envelope into her hands. You've been served. The room fell silent. 300 people holding their breath. Caroline stared at the envelope. Her name was printed across the front in cold official letters. She opened it with numb fingers, scanning the contents. The words blurred, then sharpened into devastating clarity. Derek Mercer, currently incarcerated at Federal Correctional Institution Danbury, was filing for divorce. He was claiming 50% of all marital assets. He was demanding spousal support, and he was requesting that Caroline pay his legal fees. From prison, the man who had ignored 17 phone calls while their son died, the man who had been with his mistress while Owen's heart gave out. That man was suing her. Someone gasped, then another. Phones came out. Cameras flashed. Carolyn's humiliation was being captured in real time. Miles pushed through the crowd, but he was too far away. By the time he reached the stage, the damage was done. His daughter stood frozen, the papers trembling in her hands, tears streaming down her face as 300 witnesses documented her destruction. The next morning, the video was everywhere. Grieving mother served divorce papers at charity gala. The headlines were merciless. The comments were worse. Caroline sat in her father's kitchen, staring at the legal documents spread across the table. She hadn't slept. She couldn't eat. The brief peace she had found in the months since Derek's conviction had shattered like thin ice. He's doing this from prison, she said, her voice hollow. He can't even walk free, and he's still trying to destroy me, Brim. Miles poured her a cup of coffee she wouldn't drink. His attorney is Gregory Thornton. Caroline looked up. That name, she knew that name. The most expensive divorce lawyer in Boston. Clients included senators, hedge fund managers, Fortune 500 executives. His hourly rate could pay most people's mortgages. How can Derek afford him, Judith? Miles spoke his former daughter-in-law's mother's name like a curse. She's funding the entire thing. Of course she was. Judith Mercer, whose wealth had protected Derek his entire life, whose money had paid for the lawyers who reduced his criminal sentence, whose influence had shielded him from consequences at every turn. Until now, he had only faced criminal charges. Now he was attacking on a different front. Civil court, family law, a battlefield where Judith's resources gave her son every advantage. What does he want? Caroline asked. Miles slid one of the documents toward her. He wants half of everything acquired during the marriage. The house, The investments, your mother's inheritance that came to you 3 years ago. That money was left to me specifically. Mom wanted me to have it. Derek's attorneys are arguing it was commingled with marital assets. They're claiming you used some of it for household expenses, which makes it community property. Caroline felt sick. That inheritance was sacred. Her mother had died of cancer 2 years before Owen was born. The money was all Caroline had left of her. There's more, Miles said quietly. He wants spousal support. He's claiming that because he's incarcerated and unable to work, you should be financially responsible for him. He's in prison for crimes he committed. Doesn't matter to family court. And because you've been publicly fundraising for the foundation, his attorneys are arguing you have significant income and should pay his legal fees too. Carolyn laughed. It was not a happy sound. I volunteer for the foundation. I don't take a salary. Every penny goes to the families we help. They know that. Miles's jaw tightened. They don't care. The goal isn't to win on the merits. The goal is to bury you in legal costs until you have nothing left. Litigation as warfare. Caroline stared at the documents. 6 months of healing, erased in a single night. 6 months of finding purpose, of building something meaningful from the ashes of her son's death. All of it threatened by a man who had already taken everything from her. What do I do? She whispered. Miles reached across the table and took her hand. We fight, and we win. But Caroline couldn't see how. Derek had Judith's millions. She had a father on a pension and a foundation that was barely 6 months old. How do you fight a war when the enemy can outspend you 100-to-1? She didn't know yet, but she would learn. 2 weeks later, Carolyn sat across from her divorce attorney in a conference room that smelled of old coffee and anxiety. Her attorney's name was Sarah Bennett, mid-40s, sharp eyes, a reputation for protecting women in difficult divorces. But even she looked concerned as she reviewed the latest filings. They're claiming you hid assets. Sarah said, offshore accounts, shell companies, over $2 million allegedly transferred to the Cayman Islands. That's insane. Caroline leaned forward. I've never hidden anything. I don't even know how offshore accounts work. I believe you, but they've produced documents with your signature on them. Account applications, wire transfer authorizations, all dated during your marriage. Caroline's blood ran cold. Those signatures, they couldn't be real. She had never signed anything like that. Unless Derek had forged them, he had access to everything. She said slowly, all our financial documents, all my personal information. He could have forged my signature on anything. Can you prove it? She stopped. Could she? How do you prove you didn't sign something? The burden would be on her to demonstrate forgery, and that required experts, analysis, time, all things that cost money she no longer had. There's something else. Sarah's voice softened in that way people's voices soften when they're about to deliver terrible news. The court has frozen your accounts pending investigation. What Derek's attorneys convinced a judge that you might move assets if given warning. Everything you have is locked until this is resolved. Caroline felt the walls closing in. How am I supposed to live? Pay my mortgage, pay you, Sarah hesitated. I can work with you on payment terms. But Caroline, I have to be honest, this is going to get worse before it gets better. They're not fighting fair, and they have unlimited resources. That night, Caroline stood in Owen's empty room. The bed was still made with his dinosaur sheets. His toys were still arranged on the shelves. His drawings were still taped to the walls. She came here when the grief became too heavy, when she needed to remember why she kept fighting. I'm trying, baby, she whispered to the empty room. I'm trying so hard. But the walls offered no comfort. And somewhere in a prison cell 400 miles away, Derek Mercer was winning. The next day, Miles met with an old friend. Richard Caldwell had been a federal prosecutor alongside Miles for 15 years before being appointed to the bench. Now 65. He was one of the most respected judges in the Massachusetts district. His reputation for fairness was matched only by his hatred of fraud. They met in a small cafe far from the courthouse. Two old men with coffee and memories. I can't be involved, Richard said immediately. You know that. Any hint of impropriety and the whole case gets thrown out. I'm not asking you to be involved. Miles kept his voice low. I'm asking you to promise me something. What? That if this case comes before you, you'll look at the evidence, really look. Not just what Derek's expensive attorneys present, but what's underneath. The forgeries, The fraud, the truth. Richard studied his old friend. You think he's hiding something? I think that family has been hiding things for decades. I think Judith Mercer's entire fortune is built on lies. And I think if someone digs deep enough, the whole thing comes crumbling down. Richard was quiet for a long moment. I can't make any promises about specific cases, but I can tell you this. My courtroom has never been kind to liars, and it never will be. Miles nodded. That was enough. For now. That evening, Caroline discovered something that changed everything. She was going through old bank statements, trying to document every transaction from her marriage. When she found it, a series of withdrawals she didn't remember making. Small amounts at first, then larger, totaling over $340,000 over 18 months. The money had been transferred to an account she didn't recognize, an account in Derek's name only, an account she had never known existed. He had been stealing from her for years, right under her nose, draining their savings while she trusted him, while she believed in their marriage, while she raised their son. $340,000 that should have been there when Owen got sick, when they needed to pay for treatments, specialists, medications, when the insurance Derek had secretly canceled stopped covering their son's care. She stared at the numbers until they blurred. Then she picked up her phone and called her father. I found something, she said, and I need help understanding what it means. What Miles said when he saw the evidence would set everything in motion. But that night, Caroline learned a truth that many people never discover until it's too late. The person you marry is not always the person you think you know. And sometimes, the betrayal runs deeper than you ever imagined. 3 weeks later, Caroline met Margaret Sullivan for the first time. Everyone called her Maggie. She was 53 years old with gray-streaked hair and reading glasses perpetually perched on her nose. She had spent 30 years as a forensic accountant, tracing money through shell companies, exposing fraud, unraveling the financial lies people told to protect themselves. Miles had found her, convinced her to take the case pro bono after explaining what Derek had done. I've seen a lot of bad husbands, Maggie said, as she spread papers across Caroline's dining room table. Men who hide assets, men who cheat, men who steal. But this, she shook her head. This is something else entirely. What did you find? Maggie pulled out a diagram she had created. Lines connecting boxes, names, numbers, a web of deception that made Caroline's head spin. Your husband didn't just hide money. He built an entire parallel financial life. Shell companies registered in Delaware, accounts in the Caymans, wire transfers routed through banks in 3 different countries. How much Maggie looked up? At least $2 million, probably more. Caroline sat down heavily. $2 million. While she had been clipping coupons and worrying about Owen's medical bills, while she had been wearing the same clothes for years because they couldn't afford new ones, while their son had died because Derek let the insurance lapse. $2 million. But here's the thing. Maggie's eyes gleamed with something like satisfaction. He made mistakes. The transfers left traces, and one of those traces leads somewhere very interesting, where to a woman named Vivian Ashford. Caroline's jaw tightened. The mistress, the woman Derek had been with while Owen died. Vivian had been subpoenaed during the criminal trial, forced to admit the affair. Her testimony had helped convict Derek. But apparently that wasn't all she had received from him. He transferred over $400,000 to her over 3 years. Maggie said jewelry, hers, a down payment on an apartment in Back Bay, all while he was married to you. That's marital fraud. That's exactly what it is. And under Massachusetts law, you're entitled to recover those assets. Every penny he gave her belongs to you. For the first time in weeks, Caroline felt something like hope. The motion to freeze Derek's hidden assets was filed the next morning. Sarah Bennett presented Maggie's evidence to the court. Wire transfers, bank statements, shell company registrations. Judge Caldwell reviewed everything carefully. He asked questions, he took notes, and when Sarah finished her presentation, he ruled from the bench, motion granted. All assets identified by the forensic accountant are hereby frozen pending further investigation. The respondent is ordered to provide complete financial disclosure within 30 days. Caroline watched Derek's video feed from prison, saw his face go pale, saw the confidence drain from his expression as he realized his secrets were no longer secret. That night, she and Miles celebrated with dinner at her childhood home, pasta and wine, and something that felt almost like joy. "We've got him," Miles said. "His whole house of cards is falling." Carolyn allowed herself to smile. It felt strange on her face, unfamiliar, but good. The feeling lasted exactly 18 hours. The next morning, Lawrence Pemberton filed an emergency motion on behalf of Judith Mercer. Attached to the motion were documents that turned Caroline's world upside down. The Cayman Islands accounts weren't in Derek's name. They were in Caroline's. Her signature was on every document, her social security number, her passport information. According to the paperwork, she had opened those accounts herself. She had transferred the money. She had hidden the assets. It was impossible. She had never been to the Cayman Islands. She had never opened offshore accounts. She had never hidden a single dollar from anyone. But try proving that when your signature is on every page. The fraud investigation that had been focused on Derek suddenly turned toward Carolyn. The foundation board called an emergency meeting. 2 members resigned immediately, unable to associate with someone under federal investigation. Donations plummeted. Media coverage turned hostile. One tabloid headline burned itself into her memory: "Grieving mother or greedy fraudster." There is a moment in every person's life when they face an impossible choice. When the path forward seems blocked in every direction. When surrender feels not just tempting, but logical. Carolyn had been fighting for months. Fighting grief. Fighting her husband. Fighting a system designed to protect people with money and crush people without it. Now she was being crushed. She sat in her empty house, surrounded by boxes she couldn't afford to move, holding the stuffed elephant Owen had loved, and wondered if it was time to give up. Maybe Derek was right. Maybe she should just sign whatever he wanted. Let him take the house, the money, whatever remained. At least then it would be over. At least then she could stop fighting. But every time she considered surrender, she heard Owen's voice in her memory. The voice of a 5-year-old boy who had trusted her to protect him, who had died believing his father was coming, who had deserved so much better than what he got. She couldn't give up. Not for herself, for him. The question was, how do you fight when you've already lost everything? The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday. Caroline had known it was coming. The mortgage payments she couldn't make, the bank accounts frozen by court order, the legal fees piling up like snowdrifts in a blizzard. But knowing something is coming and experiencing it are different things. She stood in the doorway of the house where Owen had taken his first steps, where he had spoken his first words, where he had woken her up on Christmas morning with sticky fingers and a gap-toothed smile. Now strangers would live here. New children would play in the backyard. New families would make new memories in rooms that still held the ghost of her son. Miles came with a truck. Neighbors watched from their porches. No one offered to help. Caroline boxed Owen's things last. His dinosaur sheets, his drawings, his books, and Peanut, the stuffed elephant he couldn't sleep without. She held the worn gray fabric to her face, breathing in a scent that was almost gone now. "I'm sorry, baby," she whispered. "I'm sorry I couldn't keep our home." The apartment Miles had found was small. 2 bedrooms in a building that smelled of other people's dinners. The walls were thin. The carpet was stained. But it was cheap, and cheap was all they could afford. Carolyn set up Owen's things in the corner of her bedroom, his elephant on the pillow, his drawings on the wall, a small shrine to a boy who would never come back. That night, Derek called. The prison had video calling now, a privilege for inmates with good behavior. Derek's face filled her phone screen, his orange jumpsuit bright against the gray walls behind him. "I heard you moved." His voice was casual, almost pleasant. "That's too bad. I always liked that house." Caroline should have hung up, should have blocked his number, should have refused to engage with the man who was systematically destroying her life. But she needed to understand, needed to know why. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You're in prison. You lost everything. Why can't you just leave me alone?" Derek smiled, that charming smile that had fooled her for 6 years. "Because you took everything from me. You testified against me, you helped your father build the case. You stood there in that courtroom and watched them take my freedom. You killed our son." The smile faltered. "Just for a moment, I didn't kill anyone. Owen's death was an accident, a tragedy. I wasn't there, but I didn't cause it. You let the insurance lapse. You ignored my calls. You were with her while our baby died." Derek's expression hardened. Vivian had nothing to do with this. She had everything to do with it. You were spending money on her while our son went without medical care. You were building a life with her while pretending to be married to me. And now I'm paying for it. Derek leaned toward the camera. 18 years in federal prison. My reputation destroyed. My career over. So yes, Caroline, I'm going to take back everything I can. I'm going to make sure that when I get out of here, I have something waiting for me. And if that means destroying you in the process, he shrugged. Consider it fair. The call ended. Carolyn sat in the darkness of her new apartment, surrounded by boxes she hadn't unpacked, and wondered how she had ever loved that man. The next week brought more bad news. Maggie Sullivan had been working around the clock, trying to prove the offshore account signatures were forged. She had found a video. Derek's former assistant had recorded him signing documents at his desk, documents that matched the ones supposedly signed by Carolyn. The assistant's name was Anna Campbell. She had worked for Derek for 3 years, and she had been building evidence against him the entire time. She had watched him lie, watched him steal, watched him betray his wife and son with cold calculation, and she had documented everything. She's willing to give a deposition. Sarah Bennett told Caroline, sworn testimony about the forgeries. With her evidence, we can prove you never signed those documents. The fraud investigation gets redirected back to Derek. When tomorrow, she's scared, but she's ready. Carolyn felt something loosen in her chest. Hope. Real hope. For the first time since the gala, she could see a path forward. That night, she slept without nightmares. She woke to her phone ringing. Miles's voice thick with something she didn't immediately recognize. Something's happened, he said. Anna Campbell. She's dead. The world stopped. What? They found her this morning. The police are calling it suicide. Caroline's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the edge of her bed, the phone pressed to her ear. Suicide. That's the official story. Miles's voice was careful. But Caroline, the timing, the convenience. You think Derek, I think Judith has connections we haven't begun to understand. I think that family protects its own at any cost. And I think we just lost our only witness. Without Anna Campbell, the video evidence was worthless. Hearsay, inadmissible. The deposition that would have saved Caroline would never happen. Derek's attorneys filed a motion that afternoon. They asked the court to dismiss all fraud allegations against their client and redirect the investigation to Carolyn. The motion was granted. Caroline was now officially under federal investigation for tax fraud, money laundering, and hiding marital assets. The foundation suspended all operations pending the outcome. Her bank accounts remained frozen. Her legal fees continued to mount. She had lost her son, her marriage, her home, her reputation, and now, possibly, her freedom. This was rock bottom, or so she thought. But rock bottom. She would learn. Had a basement. December again. 1 year since Owen died. Caroline stood in the memorial garden at midnight, her breath forming clouds in the frozen air. Snow covered the ground in a thin, white blanket, pristine and peaceful. Owen's oak tree had lost its leaves, its bare branches reaching toward a sky full of stars. She had come here to talk to him, to confess, to apologize. I tried, baby. The words came out in whispered sobs. I tried so hard, but they're going to win. They have too much money, too much power, too many people willing to lie for them. She sank to her knees in the snow, not caring about the cold seeping through her jeans. The stuffed elephant was in her hands. Peanut, the only piece of Owen she had left. I wanted to make them pay for what they did to you. I wanted to build something beautiful in your memory. But I can't. I can't fight anymore. I'm so tired. The silence of the garden pressed in around her. No answers. No comfort. Just the cold and the dark and the crushing weight of defeat. She remembered the last time she had held Owen in this garden. A sunny afternoon in October. Just 2 months before he died. He had been chasing butterflies, his laughter echoing off the stone walls. She had caught him in her arms and spun him around until they were both dizzy, collapsing onto the grass in a heap of giggles. Mommy, he had said, his small hand pressed against her cheek. I love you bigger than the whole sky. Bigger than the whole sky. That was their thing, their special phrase. The words they whispered at bedtime. The promise they made every morning. Now the sky stretched above her, vast and indifferent, and she had never felt smaller. She didn't know how long she knelt there. Minutes. Hours. Time had stopped meaning anything. The cold seeped through her coat, through her skin, into her bones. She welcomed it. The numbness was a relief from the constant ache of grief. At some point, she realized she couldn't feel her fingers anymore, couldn't feel her toes. The shivering had stopped, which somewhere in the back of her mind she knew was dangerous. Hypothermia, the body shutting down. Maybe that would be easier. Maybe if she just stayed here, let the cold take her. She could see Owen again, hold him one more time, tell him she was sorry for failing him. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like peace went on. When Miles found her at dawn, she was nearly unconscious. He had woken at 3 in the morning with a feeling he couldn't explain. A father's instinct that something was wrong. He had driven to her apartment and found it empty. Had called her phone 17 times with no answer. 17? That number again. Always that number. He had known, somehow, that she would be here. In the garden, with Owen, Caroline. His voice broke as he gathered her into his arms. She was ice cold, her lips blue, her eyes unfocused. Oh God. Caroline, stay with me. He wrapped his coat around her, carried her to his car, drove to the apartment with the heater on full blast. He didn't take her to the hospital. She would have refused, would have seen it as another defeat. Instead, he filled her bathtub with warm water and helped her into it. Clothes and all, sat on the bathroom floor while the color slowly returned to her cheeks. Made her drink hot coffee with shaking hands. You can't do that, he said, his voice rough with fear and relief. You can't give up. I don't know what else to do. Her voice was flat, dead. All the fire burned out of her. They've taken everything. My home, my money, my reputation, even the foundation. All I have left is you, and I won't let them take that too. They won't take me. Miles sat across from her, his weathered face set with determination. And they haven't taken everything. Not yet. What do you mean? He helped her out of the tub, wrapped her in blankets, led her to the couch. Then he pulled a folder from his briefcase. I've been doing my own investigation, quietly, off the books, using contacts from my years as a prosecutor. Dad, she shook her head weakly. You can't. If they find out you're investigating them, they'll come after you too. Let them try. His jaw tightened. I've spent 30 years putting criminals behind bars. I'm not afraid of Judith Mercer. Let me finish. He spread papers across the coffee table. I've been looking into Judith. Not Derek. Judith. The source of all that money. The foundation of that whole family's power. Caroline looked at the papers through bleary eyes. Financial records, news clippings, police reports, old photographs. What did you find? Miles met her eyes. 15 years ago, Judith's husband died in a hunting accident. Fall from a tree stand, ruled accidental death after a brief investigation. I remember. Derek didn't talk about it much. He said it was too painful. Miles snorted. Painful, that's one word for it. The insurance payout was $4 million. That money became the seed capital for everything Judith built afterward. Her real estate empire, her investment portfolio, all of it traced back to that single payout. Carolyn didn't understand where this was going, so she got lucky with insurance. That doesn't prove anything. So I found the original police report. Miles's voice dropped. The one that was filed before Judith's lawyers got involved, before witnesses changed their stories, before evidence disappeared from the police lockup. He pulled out a manila envelope and removed a single photograph. It showed a tree stand, twisted and broken, metal cables dangling, and beside the image, handwritten notes from the original investigating officer. The tree stand didn't fail. Miles's voice was steady, but his eyes burned with something fierce. It was sabotaged. Someone cut the support cables. Not all the way through, just enough that they would give way under weight. The original detective noted it in his report, called it suspicious, recommended a full homicide investigation. Caroline's heart began to pound despite her exhaustion. What happened to the investigation? It disappeared. The detective was transferred to another department. The evidence vanished. The death was ruled accidental within 48 hours. Fastest ruling I've ever seen for a case with this many red flags. You're saying Judith murdered her husband. I'm saying she probably did. And if I can prove it, everything she has becomes evidence in a federal investigation. Her accounts get frozen, her assets get seized. Derek's legal war against you ends overnight. For the first time in months, Carolyn felt something stir in her chest. Not quite hope, but something close. A spark in the darkness. Can you prove it? Not yet. But I know someone who can help. Someone who owes me a favor from a long time ago. Who Miles smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. An old friend at the FBI. A man named James Mitchell. He's been waiting for a chance to take down Judith Mercer for years. She destroyed his brother's business back in the 90s, bought up his loans and called them in all at once, forced him into bankruptcy. James has never forgotten. Caroline looked at her father. This man who had always been there, even when she pushed him away. This man who had fought beside her through the worst year of her life. This man who refused to let her give up. In every life, there are moments when everything changes. When the path that seemed blocked suddenly opens. When the fight that seemed lost reveals a new angle of attack. This was that moment for Caroline. She had spent a year being beaten down, watching her enemies win, losing everything she cared about while the people who hurt her thrived. Now, finally, she had a weapon, and she was going to use it. The FBI raid happened at 6 in the morning on a Thursday. Judith Mercer was eating breakfast in her mansion when the front door exploded inward. Agents in tactical gear swarmed through the house, shouting commands, securing rooms, seizing computers and documents and phones. Judith screamed. She threatened. She demanded to speak to her lawyers, to her congressman, to the president himself. It didn't matter. The warrant was ironclad. 3 months of investigation had produced enough evidence to convince a federal judge that Judith Mercer had committed insurance fraud, tax evasion, and possibly murder. The agents let her out in handcuffs, her designer bathrobe flapping in the morning breeze, her perfectly styled hair disheveled for the first time in decades. Camera crews had been tipped off somehow. The footage ran on every news channel for days. Carolyn watched from her apartment, a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. She felt nothing. No satisfaction, no triumph, just a hollow emptiness where rage used to live. Miles stood beside her. 30 years of putting criminals away. And Judith Mercer was the white whale that got away. Until now, what happens next? Her assets are frozen. All of them. Which means Derek's legal fund just evaporated. Gregory Thornton withdrew from the case that afternoon. Expensive lawyers don't work for free. And without Judith's money, Derek couldn't afford a cup of coffee from the prison commissary. The news reached him during his afternoon recreation time. A guard pulled him aside, handed him a phone, let him watch the footage of his mother being walked past a hedge of cameras. For the first time since his arrest, Derek Mercer cried. Not for his mother, not for the empire that was crumbling, for himself, for the realization that he was truly alone now. No money, no allies, no escape. The civil case collapsed within weeks. Without Thornton's aggressive tactics, Derek's remaining claims fell apart under basic scrutiny. Maggie Sullivan's forensic analysis was admitted into evidence. The forged signatures were exposed. The offshore accounts were traced back to Derek's own transactions, using Caroline's stolen identity. Judge Caldwell reviewed everything personally. He was not a man who tolerated fraud in his courtroom, and Derek Mercer had committed fraud on a spectacular scale. The ruling came down in February, all hidden assets awarded to Caroline. Derek ordered to pay full restitution for the money he had stolen during their marriage. His pension, his investments, the inheritance he had expected from Judith, all of it transferred to the woman he had tried to destroy. Derek watched the ruling via video feed from prison. When the judge finished speaking, Derek stood up and screamed. He screamed at the camera, at his public defender, at Caroline, who sat in the courtroom with her father, her face composed and calm. The guards dragged him away. His screams echoed down the corridor until a door slammed and cut them off. Carolyn walked out of the courthouse into bright winter sunlight. Photographers shouted questions. Reporters thrust microphones toward her face. She ignored them all. Miles walked beside her, silent, steady, the rock she had clung to through the worst year of her life. It's over, he said. Is it? The question hung in the air. Because for Caroline, nothing would ever really be over. Owen was still gone. Her marriage had still been a lie. The trauma of the past year had left scars that would never fully heal. But she was still standing, and that counted for something. 3 months later, Judith Mercer went to trial. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showing falsified insurance claims, witness testimony about the hunting accident that killed her husband, expert analysis proving the tree stand had been deliberately sabotaged, and one final piece of evidence that sealed her fate, a letter she had written to her lawyer 15 years ago, outlining exactly how she planned to make her husband's death look like an accident. The lawyer had kept it as insurance. When the FBI came knocking, he traded it for immunity. Judith was convicted of first-degree murder, insurance fraud, and tax evasion. The judge sentenced her to 25 years in federal prison. She would die behind bars. Derek, informed of his mother's sentence, suffered a mental breakdown. Additional charges were filed against him for his role in the civil fraud. His original 18-year sentence was extended to 30. He would be 67 years old when he became eligible for parole, assuming he lived that long. Vivian Ashford, subpoenaed to testify against both Mercers, saw her own secrets exposed in open court. The money Derek had given her, the lies she had told, the role she had played in destroying a family. Her career as a corporate consultant ended overnight. Her clients abandoned her. Her friends disappeared. She fled Boston in disgrace, eventually settling in a small town in Arizona where no one knew her name. Justice, Carolyn learned, is never as satisfying as you think it will be. It doesn't bring back what you lost. It doesn't heal the wounds. It just closes a chapter and forces you to write a new one. But at least the chapter was closed. Owen's Heart Foundation reopened in the spring. The announcement came on a Wednesday, exactly 18 months after Derek's original conviction. Caroline stood on the steps of the foundation's new headquarters, a renovated brownstone in Back Bay that had been purchased with funds recovered from Derek's hidden accounts. The irony was not lost on her. The money he had stolen to fund his affair was now funding the organization dedicated to their son's memory. The board members who had resigned returned with apologies and donations. Some brought flowers, others brought checks. All of them brought shame, pardon, written clearly on their faces as they approached the woman they had abandoned. Caroline accepted their apologies gracefully. She had learned that bitterness was a poison you drink yourself. These people had been scared. They had believed the lies. And now they wanted to make amends. She would let them. Donations flooded in from people who had followed Caroline's story, who had watched her fight against impossible odds and win. Corporate sponsors lined up, eager to associate their brands with a narrative of justice and redemption. Grant applications were approved within weeks instead of months. Within 6 months, the foundation had helped over 500 families. Carolyn threw herself into the work with an intensity that worried her father, traveling to hospitals across New England, meeting with parents in waiting rooms, sharing her story with anyone who would listen. Each child she helped felt like a small redemption. Each family she supported was a tiny piece of meaning carved from the wreckage of her loss. Dr. Eleanor Graves, the cardiologist who had joined the foundation's board, became her closest ally. Eleanor had been the attending physician the night Owen died. She had performed chest compressions on his tiny body for 45 minutes. She had been the one to call time of death, and she had carried that guilt ever since. I think about him every day. Eleanor confessed one evening as they reviewed applications for the foundation's emergency fund. They were alone in the office, surrounded by stacks of files and the soft glow of desk lamps. I replay that night over and over, wondering if I could have done something different, if I could have saved him. Caroline reached across the desk and took her hand. You did everything possible. Owen's heart was too damaged. It wasn't your fault. But Eleanor shook her head. It wasn't about the medicine. It was about the system. If Owen had proper monitoring at home, you would have known sooner that he was in distress. If his insurance hadn't been canceled, he would have had the medications that could have stabilized him. The system failed him, Caroline. And I was part of that system. That's why we're here. Caroline gestured at the files around them. That's why we do this work. Every child we save. That's Owen's legacy. That's what he left behind. Eleanor nodded, wiping her eyes. He would be proud of you. I know it's not my place to say, but I think he would be so proud. Caroline felt the familiar ache in her chest, the one that never fully went away. I hope so. Some days I'm not sure. Some days I feel like I'm just going through the motions, pretending to be strong because people expect it. Eleanor studied her for a long moment. That's not weakness. Caroline, that's courage. Doing the hard thing even when you don't feel like it. Showing up even when you want to hide. That's what bravery looks like for people like us. People like us. The grieving. The broken. The ones who had lost pieces of themselves that could never be recovered. Carolyn nodded slowly. Something is better than nothing, she said softly. One step at a time, one child at a time, one day at a time. That became the Foundation's unofficial motto. One child at a time, a year after the Foundation's reopening. Carolyn gave a keynote speech at a national pediatric health conference. 3,000 people in the audience, doctors, nurses, administrators, policymakers, people with the power to change systems. She told Owen's story, the 17 phone calls, the insurance that lapsed, the husband who prioritized his mistress over his dying child. She told it without flinching, without sanitizing, without protecting anyone's feelings. And then she told them what needed to change. No family should ever face what I faced, she said, looking out at the audience. No child should ever die because their parents couldn't afford monitoring equipment. No mother should ever have to call her husband 17 times while her baby takes his last breath. The audience was silent, riveted. 3,000 people hanging on her every word. We talk about healthcare reform like it's an abstract concept, she continued, like it's about numbers and budgets and political philosophies. But it's not. It's about children, real children, with names and face and futures. Children like Owen. She paused, composing herself. The emotion was always there, just beneath the surface. She had learned to use it, to channel it, but never to suppress it entirely. My son died because our system failed him, because the people who should have protected him chose not to. I can't bring him back. I can't change what happened, but I can make sure his death means something. I can fight for the children who are still here, and I will fight until my last breath. She looked at the Foundation's logo projected on the screen behind her, a small heart with Owen's name beneath it. This is for him. This is for all of them. And this is for every parent who has ever held their child's hand and prayed for one more day. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. People were crying. Doctors who had seen countless deaths were wiping their eyes. Administrators who dealt in spreadsheets and budgets were reaching for tissues. Afterward, a young mother approached Caroline in the lobby. She was holding a baby girl, maybe 6 months old, with dark hair and bright eyes that reminded Caroline painfully of Owen. She has a heart condition, the woman said. Her voice trembled with the particular desperation Caroline knew all too well. The doctors say she needs monitoring equipment, but our insurance won't cover it. We applied to your foundation 3 months ago. I haven't heard anything. I'm so scared. Caroline looked at the baby, at her tiny fingers curled into fists, at her chest rising and falling with each precious breath. What's her name, Lily? Caroline reached out and touched the baby's soft cheek. She thought about Owen, about all the moments she would never have with him, about the life he never got to live, but also about the lives that could still be saved, the futures that were still possible, the children who still had a chance. Lily is beautiful, she said, and she's going to be okay. I promise you that. I'm going to personally make sure your application is processed tomorrow, and if there's any problem with approval, you call me directly. She pressed her business card into the woman's trembling hand. The monitoring equipment was delivered to Lily's family the following week, paid for by Owen's Heart Foundation. One more child saved, one more family protected, one more piece of meaning carved from the wreckage. December again, 2 years since Owen died. Caroline visited the memorial garden alone. The oak tree had grown noticeably since the last time she was here, its trunk thicker, its branches reaching higher toward the winter sky. In a few years, it would provide real shade for families visiting the garden. In a few decades, it would tower over everything around it, a living monument to a boy who had died too young. She sat on the bench beside the tree, watching her breath form clouds in the cold air. Snow had fallen overnight, blanketing the garden in white. Everything was still and peaceful. The city noise seemed far away, muffled by the snow and the high stone walls. "Hi, baby," she said softly. "It's Mom. She came here often now. Not every day. Like in the beginning, when the grief was so fresh, it felt like drowning. The pain had evolved into something she could carry without being crushed. But she still needed these moments, these conversations with the son she would never stop missing. I spoke at another conference last week. She told the tree, imagining Owen's face in its bark, his smile and the pattern of its branches. Almost 4,000 people. They gave me an award. Can you believe that? Your mom getting awards? She laughed softly, the sound catching in her throat. Your grandpa cried so hard. You would have laughed at him. He tries to be so tough. Acts like nothing bothers him. But when they called my name, when all those people stood up and clapped, he just lost it, tears streaming down his face like a waterfall. She pulled Owen's stuffed elephant from her bag. Peanut was worn now. His gray fabric faded, one of his button eyes hanging by a thread. His stuffing had shifted over the years, making him lumpy and misshapen. But she couldn't give him up, would never give him up. He was the last physical connection to her son. Your foundation helped 1,000 families this year. 1,000, Owen. Can you imagine 1,000 little kids who got the care they needed because of you? The wind rustled through the bare branches of the oak tree. Carolyn chose to believe it was Owen, answering her, telling her he was listening. I met a little girl last month. Her name is Lily. She has a heart condition, just like you did. Her parents couldn't afford the monitoring equipment, couldn't afford the medications. They were so scared. Owen, I saw it in their eyes, the same fear I used to feel. She pressed Peanut against her chest. But we helped them. The foundation gave them everything they needed. And now Lily is doing great, healthy, happy. Her mom sends me pictures every week. She took her first steps last Tuesday. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. I miss you every day, every single day. There are moments when I forget, just for a second. I'll see something funny and think, Owen would love that. Or I'll hear a song you used to like and start to call you. And then I remember, and it hits me all over again, like losing you fresh. She sat in silence for a while, watching the snow drift down from the gray sky. Each flake was unique, delicate, beautiful in its brief existence before melting into nothing. Like children, she thought, like Owen. But I'm okay, she finally said. I'm really okay. Not the okay I used to be. Before, that version of me died with you, but a different kind of okay. The kind you find on the other side of something terrible. When you realize you survived it and you're still here and there's still a reason to keep going. She talked to him for another hour, sharing everything and nothing. The Foundation's new initiatives. The article she was writing for a medical journal about pediatric cardiac care access. The nice man from the conference who had asked for her number. His name is Daniel. She confessed, feeling oddly like a teenager telling secrets to a friend. He's a cardiologist. Works with kids like you. He asked me to coffee 3 times before I finally said yes. And then I sat there the whole time talking about you, about the foundation, about everything except normal first date stuff. I think I scared him. She smiled through her tears. But he called the next day, asked me to dinner, said he'd never met anyone who cared so much about their work, about making a difference. Said he wanted to know more. The wind rustled the branches again. I said no. I'm not ready. Might never be ready. And that's okay too. You were the great love of my life. Owen, you and your grandpa. That's enough for me. When she finally stood to leave, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She pressed her hand against the oak tree's trunk, feeling its rough bark, its solid presence. I love you, Owen. I will always love you. And I will never, ever stop fighting for children like you. That's my promise. That's what you taught me. She walked away through the snow, leaving footprints that would fill in and disappear by morning. Behind her, the oak tree stood steady and strong, growing taller with each passing year, just like his mother. 3 years after Owen's death, the Owen Mercer Pediatric Heart Center opened on a bright spring morning. It was housed in a new wing of Boston Children's Hospital, a gleaming structure of glass and steel that seemed to catch and hold the sunlight. The building had been funded by donations to the foundation and a massive grant Caroline had personally secured from a billionaire philanthropist who had lost his own daughter to heart disease. His name was Robert Morrison. He was 73 years old, one of the richest men in New England, and he had spent 40 years trying to outrun the grief of losing his child. When Caroline met him at a fundraising event and told Owen's story, He had written a check for $10 million on the spot. Build something that matters, he had said, his eyes wet with decades-old tears. Build something that saves them. And she had. The ribbon-cutting ceremony drew hundreds of people, doctors in white coats, politicians in expensive suits, donors with checkbooks ready, families the foundation had helped, parents holding children who were alive because of this work. They gathered on the lawn beneath a banner that bore Owen's name and his photograph, forever 5 years old, forever smiling. That gap-toothed grin that Caroline saw every time she closed her eyes. Caroline stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd. She had prepared a speech, but the words on the paper seemed inadequate for this moment, so she spoke from the heart instead. 5 years ago, she began. I was a different person, a mother, a wife. Someone who believed the world was basically fair and good, that if you loved hard enough and tried hard enough, things would work out. She paused, steadying herself. Then my son died. My husband was convicted of crimes I couldn't have imagined, and everything I believed was shattered into a million pieces. The crowd was silent. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. For a long time, I didn't know who I was anymore. I didn't know if I wanted to keep living. The grief was so heavy, so all-consuming, that I couldn't imagine carrying it for another day, let alone the rest of my life. She looked at the building behind her, its windows reflecting the spring sky. But here's what I've learned. Grief doesn't go away. It doesn't get smaller. You just get stronger. You learn to carry it. You learn to build a life around it. And if you're very lucky, you find a way to transform it into something meaningful. Her eyes found Miles in the crowd. Her father, 70 now, his hair completely white, his face lined with age and experience. He had been her rock through everything, her constant, her reminder that she was loved even when she couldn't love herself. This center exists because of my son, because of his life, his death, and everything that came after. Every child who walks through these doors will receive the care Owen deserved. Every family will have the support we were denied. And every time a doctor saves a young heart in this building, Owen's memory will be part of that miracle. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment, the culmination of 3 years of work and grief and determination. To the families who have lost children, I see you. I know your pain. And I want you to know that it's possible to survive it. Not to get over it, never that. But to keep living, to find meaning, to honor the children we've lost by fighting for the children who are still here. The ribbon was cut, the doors opened, and Caroline walked through them, leading the first tour of the facility that would bear her son's name forever. The center was beautiful, state-of-the-art equipment in every room, comfortable spaces for families to wait and rest, a playroom filled with toys and books and games, and on every wall, photographs of children the foundation had helped, smiling faces that represented lives saved and futures protected. In the main lobby, there was a special display. Owen's photograph, enlarged and framed, his stuffed elephant, Peanut, carefully preserved in a glass case, and a plaque that read, "In memory of Owen Mercer, who taught us that love is bigger than the whole schemierarchy." Caroline stood before the display for a long moment, her hand pressed against the glass. "We did it, baby," she whispered. "We really did it." That evening, she had dinner with Miles at a small Italian restaurant near his house, their favorite spot. They had been coming here since she was a teenager, back when her mother was still alive and the world seemed simple and safe. The same booth, the same red checkered tablecloth, the same candle flickering between them. "I'm proud of you," Miles said over pasta and wine. "Your mother would be too." "I know. Dad." Caroline reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Thank you. For everything. For never giving up on me, even when I gave up on myself." Miles's eyes glistened in the candlelight. That's what fathers do. They talked late into the night. About Owen, about the foundation, about the future and what it might hold. The good memories now, the happy ones. The first time Owen had said Grandpa, the time he had tried to feed spaghetti to the dog, the way he used to fall asleep in Miles's arms during baseball games on TV. They didn't talk about Derek, rotting in prison with 30 years stretching ahead of him. Didn't talk about Judith, who had died of a heart attack 6 months into her sentence. alone in a prison hospital with no one to hold her hand. Didn't talk about Vivian, who had vanished into obscurity somewhere in the Arizona desert. Those people didn't matter anymore. They had lost, completely and totally. And the woman they had tried to destroy had risen from the ashes to build something beautiful. Some stories don't have happy endings, Carolyn said, as they finished their wine. They have earned endings, hard-won endings, endings that come not from luck or fate, but from the stubborn refusal to give up. Miles nodded slowly. This is yours, Caroline, your earned ending. She smiled, really smiled, for what felt like the first time in years. Not an ending, she said, a beginning. 5 years after Owen's death, Carolyn stood in the memorial garden on a perfect June morning. The oak tree had grown tall enough to provide real shade now, its leaves rustling in a warm breeze that carried the scent of roses and honeysuckle. Birds sang in its branches. Butterflies danced around its trunk. Owen would have loved it. He had always loved butterflies. She wasn't alone. Behind her, a small crowd had gathered. Foundation staff in matching blue shirts, board members who had become friends, families they had helped over the years, some holding children who were alive because of the foundation's work, and one person who was new. His name was Daniel, the cardiologist who had asked her to coffee 3 times before she said yes. He had joined Owen's Heart Center 2 years ago, and somewhere along the way, coffee had become dinner, and dinner had become something more. He was patient, kind. He understood that she would never fully heal, that there would always be a piece of her heart that belonged to a 5-year-old boy with dark hair and a gap-toothed smile. He loved her anyway, loved her because of it, not despite it. They weren't married, might never be, but they were together, and that was more than Caroline had ever expected to find again. Miles stood beside her, his arm linked through hers. 72 now, moving slower than he used to, his joints stiff on cold mornings, but his eyes were still sharp, still fierce, still the father who had fought beside her through everything. Today was the 5th anniversary of Owen's death. Every year, they gathered here to remember him, to honor him, to remind themselves why the work mattered. Carolyn stepped forward to address the small crowd. 5 years ago, I lost my son, and for a long time, I thought my life was over. I thought the grief would swallow me whole. I thought the people who hurt us would win. She looked at the oak tree, its branches stretching toward the sky. But here's what I've learned. Grief is not the enemy. Grief is love with nowhere to go. And when you find somewhere for it to go, when you channel it into purpose and meaning and action, it becomes the most powerful force in the world. She thought about all the children the foundation had helped, the thousands of families, the medical center that bore Owen's name, the lives saved, the futures protected, the parents who got to keep their babies because of work that began with loss. Owen lived for 5 years, just 5 years. But in those 5 years, he taught me more about love than most people learn in a lifetime. He taught me how to be brave, how to be kind, how to find joy in small moments, how to see the magic in ordinary things. Her voice caught. She steadied herself. And in the 5 years since he died, he's taught me something else. He's taught me that love doesn't end with death. That legacy isn't about how long you live, but about what you leave behind. That one small life can change the world. She knelt beside the oak tree, pressing her hand against its trunk. The bark was rough beneath her fingers, full of life and growth and possibility. Somewhere in those roots was the essence of her son, nourishing this tree, helping it grow. I miss you every day. Baby, she whispered so quietly only the tree could hear. But I'm okay. I'm really, truly okay. She stood up and faced the crowd. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for remembering Owen with me. And thank you for helping me prove that even the worst grief can become something beautiful. The gathering dispersed slowly. People hugged, shared stories, remembered the children they had lost, and celebrated the children they had saved. Someone had brought Owen's favorite cookies, chocolate chip with extra chocolate, and they passed them around like communion. Daniel kissed Caroline's cheek and gave her space, understanding what she needed. Miles squeezed her hand and went to talk with the families. Everyone knew she needed these last moments alone. She sat on the bench beneath Owen's tree, watching the leaves dance in the breeze. The shadows moved across the grass like gentle waves. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed, and the sound no longer broke her heart. It filled it. They thought grief would break me, she said to the empty garden, to the tree, to Owen. They thought silence would bury me. But some women don't break. We burn. And when we rise from the ashes, we make sure the ones who tried to destroy us can never hurt anyone again. The wind whispered through the leaves, soft and warm, like a child's breath on her cheek. I kept my promise, baby. I built something beautiful in your name. I helped so many children, so many families. Every single one of them carries a piece of you in their hearts, even if they never knew you. She pulled Peanut from her bag, the worn stuffed elephant that had traveled with her everywhere for 5 years. She pressed him against her heart one last time, breathing in the faded scent that was almost gone now. Then she walked to the base of the oak tree and tucked Peanut into a hollow between the roots. A gift for Owen, a piece of his childhood, returned to him at last. Keep him safe, she whispered to the tree, until I see you again. She stood up, brushing dirt from her knees, and looked at the garden one last time. The flowers blooming in vibrant colors, the fountain bubbling peacefully, the tree that would grow taller each year, providing shade for generations of visitors who would never know the boy it memorialized. But they would know his name. They would know his story. And they would know that even the shortest life can leave the longest legacy. Carolyn closed her eyes and smiled. Not all stories have happy endings, but some have better ones, earned ones, the kind that come from walking through fire and emerging on the other side. Scarred, but standing. This was her story. A story of loss and love, of betrayal and justice, of grief transformed into purpose, of a mother who refused to let her son's death be meaningless. And it wasn't over. Not yet. She had years ahead of her, more children to help, more families to support, more lives to save in Owen's name, Daniel to love, her father to cherish, a future that was full of possibility. But for this moment, in this garden, beneath this tree, she allowed herself to rest. She had earned it. The oak tree stretched its branches toward the sky, growing stronger with each passing day. Its roots reached deep into the earth, anchored and unshakable. Its leaves rustled in the wind, singing a song of resilience and hope, just like his mother, just like his legacy, forever.